I'm I'm a professor here at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and I co-organise with people from Health Law in Canada and the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation this debate, but also the conference tomorrow. If some of you who are here are interested still in registering for the conference tomorrow, there's some flyers outside, some posters outside. We already had an event today at 12:30, a presentation by Josephine Johnson. So it's a very intense 3 days, or 2 days actually, with 3 events on assisted human reproduction. We're very happy that you're here to hear a very, in Canada, certainly a very timely debate between Françoise Baylis and Vida Panitch. I will say very little. I will only remind you of one thing. If you have a hearing disability like I have, you can actually follow online the debate in live text. You can follow the text on your computer screen. There's some information available in forms, the white forms that you find on the front table here. You'll also find flyers there for 2 books that have been published in the last 3 years on assisted human reproduction in Canada. I won't do very much. I will only introduce the chair, and I will then step back and actually help manage the camera. So I'm very happy that Roxanne Mikituk is able to chair this session. Roxanne is a long-standing colleague and friend. She's a professor at Osgoode Hall Law School, where she teaches in the areas of disability law, health law, bioethics, and family law. She's the founder and director of the Disability Law Intensive Clinical Program and the new director of Osgoode's part-time LLM program specializing in health law. Professor Mikituk is also the faculty co-chair of Enable Work. She was senior legal researcher for the Canadian Royal Commission on New Reproductive Technology, so we couldn't have a better chair. From 2002 to 2006, she was a member of the Ontario Advisory Committee. Actually, we were there together on genetics. From 2005 and 2008, she was a member of the Ethics Committee of the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. Professor Mikituk was scholar in residence in 2009 at the Law Commission of Ontario, working on the Disability and Law Project. Her current research interests focus on the intersection of disability and reproductive rights, as well as the accommodation of episodic disability in the workplace. Roxanne, I leave it up to you.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. Before I introduce you to our 2 presenters for this evening, I want to take just a few minutes to outline the current legislative and regulatory framework within which the issue of the debate is being situated. And as you know, that issue is whether the prohibition on payment for surrogacy and gametes in Canada should be repealed. It was decided that I should do this rather than the debaters taking their time this evening doing that. I am not a PowerPoint user, and so I am going to muddle my way through this. Okay, just a second here. Okay, the Canada's Assisted Human Reproduction Act, as you can see here, contains a declaratory statement section at the very beginning that outlines a number of principles that shape or inform the subsequent sections that are contained in the legislation, and also the interpretation of those sections. One of the principles, and there are a number of principles that are articulated in the Act, one of those principles is that is articulated here. And it says that trade in the reproductive capabilities of women and men and the exploitation of children, women, and men for commercial ends raise health and ethical concerns that justify their prohibition. So arguably that is one section of the legislation that is relevant to the debate this evening. The legislation then contains a number of prohibited activities. For the purposes of the debate this evening, it is sections 6 and Section 7 that are relevant. And what you'll see here is that Section 6 prohibits anyone from paying a female person to be a surrogate, from offering to pay her, or advertising to pay her for surrogacy services. Okay? It's also prohibited to accept payment for arranging, offering to arrange, or advertising surrogacy services, or, as number 3, subsection 3 says, to pay another person to do any of those things. Okay? So that's Section 6. Another one of the prohibited activities under the Act is Section 7, and that prohibits anyone from purchasing, offering to purchase, or advertising for purchase sperm or ova from a donor or someone acting on their behalf. Okay? So those are the prohibitions that are relevant for this evening. You'll note, though, that women are not prohibited from acting as surrogates, and individuals are not prohibited from donating their gametes under the legislation. So it's the commercialization of the activity that is prohibited, not the activity itself. Okay, so what you'll see is that Section 12 of the Assisted Human Reproduction Act does allow that in accordance with regulations that are to be made pursuant to this piece of legislation, that gamete donors can be reimbursed for receipted expenses that are incurred in the course of donating, that any person can be reimbursed for expenses incurred for the maintenance or transport of an in vitro embryo, and surrogate mothers can be reimbursed for expenses in relation to the surrogacy, and for loss of work-related income during the pregnancy. The problem has been that regulations clarifying what those reimbursements are that are legal under the Act were never regulated, or were never drafted, rather. Okay? However, recently, on October 26, 2018, proposed new regulations were finally released, and they state which expenses incurred by gamete donors and surrogates can be reimbursed. So you'll see that those include, in the case of donating of ova or sperm, and what we'll see when I flip the screen, this applies also in the case of surrogates, that travel expenditures, including transportation, parking, meals, accommodation, the care of dependents, counseling services, legal services and disbursements, drugs and device, and there's a particular section of the Food and Drug Act that we've got to take a look at in defining those. Products or services provided by or recommended in writing by a medical practitioner, health, disability, life insurance, and expenditures for obtaining or confirming medical or other records are then included in the list of what are reimbursable expenditures. And there's another provision that says that you need to have the proper receipting under the legislation or under regulations for those expenditures to be properly receipted. What we see in addition, I'm just going to flip ahead, is that in the case of surrogacy, maternity clothes, expenses related to delivery, and also products or services provided by or recommended to assist, assess, monitor, and provide the health care to women during her pregnancy, delivery, or postpartum are also included. Okay? I'm just going to back up for a second. In relation to this maintenance and transport of in vitro embryos, we saw that we knew that any person could be reimbursed for those expenses. That includes, we see here, expenses in relation to storage, and in relation to transport, it also includes the cost of the shipping container and the preparation of those embryos for transportation. Okay, so there's a bit of clarification there with respect to those expenses. And then finally here, we see that there's also some stipulation with respect to the criteria in relation to claims for reimbursement in relation to loss of work-related income. Okay? So that's all I really want to say by way of setting the legislative and regulatory context within which the debate is being situated. I'm going to introduce our debaters in a second. What I'm going to do is just tell you what the framework of the debaters is right now. Each of them is going to have 12 minutes to make her argument. That is going to be followed by a 5-minute rebuttal. There is then going to be an opportunity for me to ask a question or two, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. I've been asked to have you identify yourself to the speaker and to please ask your question slowly so that it can be captioned. Okay? So with all of that background, I'm delighted to introduce Vita Panitch. First of all, Vita is an associate professor of philosophy and the director of ethics and public affairs at Carleton University. Her research addresses the moral boundaries of markets, specifically markets in public goods, including healthcare and education, and physical goods, including body parts and intimate services. Vita's work explores the extent to which theories of exploitation and commodification can help us determine the appropriate regulation of so-called repugnant markets. She has published in various scholarly journals on a variety of topics, but her primary scholarly contributions have explored the dimensions of exploitation and commodification in sexual and gestational labor. A couple of her most recent publications are a book entitled Exploitation from Theory to Practice, co-edited with Monique DeVoe, which focuses heavily on exploitation in gestational and care labor, published in 2017 by Roman and Littlefield, and she is currently working on a single-authored monograph tentatively titled Parts and Labor, Market, Morals, and the Human Body. Françoise Baylis is an internationally renowned bioethics expert. In 1991, Françoise was a consultant to the Royal Commission on Reproductive Technologies. From 1994 to 97, she was a member of the Ethics Committee of the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada. And from 97 to 98, she was a consultant to the SOGC and the CFAS on their joint policy statement, Ethical Issues in Assisted Reproduction. From 2000 to 2004, Françoise consulted with Health Canada on various aspects of the draft legislation, and she consulted with the Government of Canada after the Assisted Human Reproduction Act received royal assent in 2004. From 2006 to 2010, she was a member of the Board of Directors of Assisted Human Reproduction Canada. Françoise is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. Please join me in welcoming our presenters.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm not going to say too much by way of preliminary because I only have 12 minutes and I got a lot of stuff to get through. What I will say, just to get started, is that a debate on this issue, for and against, is a sort of fun way of having the conversation, but what I want to say is just, for any Rebecca Bloom fans out there, the situation is a lot more nuanced than that. So I think I have I'm going to sort of make the case that I'm here to make, which is, in favor of a repeal. But I hope that, as the debate continues, I will have the opportunity to explain the various ways in which I think this is a nuanced kind of question that certainly deserves a nuanced answer. So, I am a philosopher, I'm an ethicist. The question that I'm primarily interested in is with respect to, right, Section 2F of the AHRA, which again tells us that trade in the reproductive capabilities of women and men raises ethical concerns that justify their prohibition. Right, so I'm really here tonight just to talk about what these ethical concerns might be, and to see, frankly, whether they do indeed justify a prohibition on payment to surrogates and to gamete donors. So the ethical concerns that tend to get raised in this discourse are around wrongful commodification of the body in particular, the erosion of altruism in society, and the potential for the exploitation of vulnerable members of our society. So I'm just going to speak to each of these points, because for the sake of arguing in favor of a repeal on this prohibition, I'm going to try to tell you that I don't think these are persuasive ethical concerns. Okay. So we'll start with commodification, right, or wrongful commodification. When we make an anti-commodification argument, what we're saying is that some things shouldn't have a price tag or a dollar value, presumably because they are valuable beyond price. Okay? So one way we can make this case is to say that the body has a kind of intrinsic value, and that we disregard that intrinsic value when we assign it a kind of use value or instrumental values accorded with a price. So, is it wrong to assign a price tag to the body? Maybe, but guess what? We do it every day. Right? You all sell your body every day. There's no job you can do without it. And we may want to draw some kind of distinction between the inside of the body and the outside of the body, but I, challenge you to try to use the outside of your body for work without also using the inside of your body. So the idea that we shouldn't commodify the body because it has some kind of intrinsic value, maybe that's true, but we do it all the time. We might kind of isolate gametes and surrogacy as the kinds of things specifically that shouldn't have a price tag. Oh, but they do, right? The global fertility market is worth something around $20 billion, and it's growing by like 9% annually. So it has a price tag. Somebody is making money off this, off surrogacy, off gamete donation. Somebody is making, lots of people are making lots of money. So why shouldn't surrogates and gamete donors? There is already a price tag. What about the argument that we shouldn't assign price tags to these items or to the body because it undermines human dignity? Dignity is a slippery term in ethics because people use it all the time for whatever their pet cause happens to be. So if somebody says it's undignified to assign a price tag to the body, somebody could just as easily reply, well, it's undignified not to be paid for the work that you do, right? Wages are a way of recognizing, of valuing people's contributions, and so not according a wage could be considered undignified. So could telling people what they can and can't do with their bodies. So dignity just doesn't get us very far because, right, it can be appealed to, apologies, it can be appealed to on either side of the argument. What about altruism? This is in many respects another way of making a kind of commodification claim. It's another way of saying some things shouldn't have a price tag because when we assign them a price tag, we are allowing the market to penetrate a sphere of human relations where it oughtn't. We are allowing market norms like self-interest to infiltrate relationships that should be governed by beneficence, right? Not by personal gain or not by a motive for personal gain. So the worry about altruism is a worry that when we introduce a profit motive into a certain kind of relationship, we crowd out the motives to do good for others, right? To act out of beneficence, to be altruistic. But the truth is these things are not mutually exclusive. Think about a pediatric oncologist, right? She gets paid a lot of money, but we still think she does noble work. right? We don't think that her interest in cashing a paycheck eclipses whatever is altruistic about the work that she has chosen to do, right? As opposed to being the CEO of some oil company. Right? She's clearly chosen to do something that provides good to others. We don't blame her for accepting payment for this. We don't think it erodes her altruistic motives. Moreover, there are lots of ways to promote altruism in our societies. We could ask farmers to reserve a share of their grain for the hungry. We could ask homeowners who have an extra room in their house to, share it with a woman who needs to escape a bad relationship. There's all sorts of ways we could promote altruism that we do not. So I worry that when we talk about the altruism of surrogates and of gamete donors, and specifically egg donors, what we're actually doing is appealing to something that I call the patriarchal expectation of gendered altruism. Women in our society are expected to be altruistic. The gender roles they are assigned are associated with actions and undertakings that are primarily beneficent in nature. And we criticize women who flout their gender norms precisely because they are not exhibiting the kind of altruism that we expect women to exhibit. One little way of looking at this is to note that 2/3 of organ donors are women, and 2/3 of kidney donors are women, and 2/3 of recipients are men. So, right, 70% of organ donors are women, and 70% of kidney recipients are men. Women are being much more altruistic, right? They are doing the giving, men are doing the receiving. I think this very much has to do with a gendered expectation of altruism. And so I worry when we pick out undertakings that we associate with women and say, no, these must be done purely from altruism. What we're actually doing is not talking about altruism at all, but about gender inequality. Okay, so the third type of ethical concern that gets raised are concerns about exploitation. And when I said earlier, the question is nuanced, this is why. I think that this is a very legitimate worry. And a lot of my research focuses on exploitation and what it means and when it happens and what to do about it. So there are criteria that make something an exploitative transaction. There could be deception, misinformation, coercion, inducement. Okay, and I don't have a ton of time, but I'm happy to come back to some of these points. I think the most relevant one is the worry about inducement. That is, the offer of payment might be tempting to somebody who would prefer not to do this, right, but can't quite refuse because she has no other options. I think this is a legitimate worry, and I definitely think it's a legitimate worry when we're talking about global surrogacy, global egg donation in particular. What I want to say in response to this, however, is that I think our legislative efforts should be spent advocating for a basic income. There's a lot of research that is starting to show that women are far less likely to go into the intimate trades, by which I primarily mean the sex work, when they have a regular income that they can count on. We don't have enough data on this. Too bad Ontario didn't go ahead with its pilot. We might have generated more data, but there's reason to think that women will enter the intimate trades at a lower rate where they have a basic income to count on. So I'm not sure that the worry about inducement justifies a ban on paying surrogates and egg donors. I think it speaks in favor of a federal basic income. Primarily because if we acknowledge that, surrogates go into work they might rather not do, but they need the money, well, so do a lot of people, right? There's a lot of waged labor that is induced or exploited in this sense. And again, I think a basic income might be a way of addressing that. How am I doing for time?
You've got four minutes.
Okay. So I'm going to say something that's a little bit contentious, and then I'm going to say something that's a bit more of an olive branch in the 4 minutes remaining. One of the other criteria for calling something exploitative is that there's an injustice that occurs, usually with respect to how some set of goods is divided up between the people who have interacted together to produce that good. Right? So when we talk about sweatshop labor being exploitative, what we mean is the workers aren't getting paid well, among many other things, right? Unsafe work conditions, etc., but they're not being paid properly. So when we use the term exploitation, what we very often mean is that somebody is being underpaid or not paid at all. So when we talk about surrogacy, paid surrogacy as being exploitative or paid gamete donation as being exploitative, I suggest that in fact unpaid surrogacy is exploitative to the extent that it represents an unfair distribution of the value that is created from that interaction. We might even go so far as to say that exploitation happens when somebody isn't paid, right, while others get rich off the transaction that she is a part of, but also that she is exploited if she is deceived in any way by the people that she transacts with. In particular, if the people she transacts with tell her, well, you can't have a share of this money because what you do is too valuable to have a price, while they pocket all of it. Okay? So not only is an injustice occurring in this kind of transaction, but a manipulation or a deception that undermines autonomy. As a final point, what I want to say is with respect to payment versus reimbursement. Right? We're in the process of clarifying what surrogates and gamete donors can be reimbursed for. I think this is a valuable exercise. Right? That is, I don't think we should scrap the whole project. I think talking about reimbursement is way better than not talking about reimbursement. But what I want to say is that this is kind of an academic distinction. And unfortunately, it's a burdensome one. That is, I'm happy to know that gamete donors and surrogates can be reimbursed, and particularly reimbursed for lost labor costs. But when we reimburse for lost labor costs, what we are effectively doing is reimbursing for what economists call opportunity costs, what you could be doing, what you could be making if you weren't doing this. And this is a key justification for wages. Reimbursing somebody for lost opportunity costs is a key argument for why we pay wages in the first place. The problem with reimbursement is that it imposes burdens on surrogates to justify themselves. They have to get a letter testifying that they would have made this or made that by whomever who would have been paying them otherwise. I don't think we have a rationale for imposing this kind of burden on surrogates. I think we need one. And we need one that doesn't appeal to the commodification, altruism, or exploitation objections that isn't prepared to meet those objections. And I don't think we have as yet in our public dialogue met those challenges. Thank you.
Well, this is the end of the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, let's start again. Thank you very much. I want to start with a very strong statement that I support family making. I think it's a wonderful thing if people are able to have children, and I recognize that a number of people are confronted with challenges in pursuing that goal. If children are wanted and cherished, it's a great thing, and that's whether we're talking about heterosexual families, homosexual families, single parenting, or any other number of combinations, because parenting is about willfully taking on responsibilities to care for another human being and to bring them up to be a member of civic society. And I think that's a wonderful thing. The second thing I want to say very clearly is that I support the legislation. That doesn't mean there aren't a few things that I would like to see be changed. Like everyone, I'm sure there's at least a line or two that you'd rather say something else. But by and large, I support the orientation, the direction, and specifically with respect to tonight's topic, I support the commitment to having a system that's founded on altruism, not commercialization. And so basically what that means is I think that the system we have in place of reimbursement, which you've already heard has taken a long time to get in place, and I have been one of its loudest critics with respect to that particular issue. But we have experience from around the world that actually suggests that other countries which have a very similar healthcare system to ours, other countries that appear to have values, social values that are very similar to ours, are able to work effectively with an altruistic system. Canada has had one in theory for a very long time. It's never had a chance to work, and I'm excited for the regulations to come into play and for us to allow it to have a chance. The next thing that I want to say is that the principles stated at the beginning are strong, powerful, ethical statements about what the legislation is attempting to achieve, because in fact policies are attempts to put in place some formal mechanisms to deal with our social values, beliefs, and mores. This is the principle that you've already seen. It's the one that's at issue here. And again, what we're talking about then is an ethical reason to justify the prohibition. Now, one of the things I want to say very clearly with respect to this prohibition is that the legislation does not target the women who participate in these activities. The way the prohibitions are written, one is looking to identify the buyers as the people who are in fact violating the law. And I think here, that's an important thing to remember, especially when we hear comments to the effect that people are being victimized or people are being criminalized. We can't make those statements in general ways like that. We need to be very clear what we're talking about. Now, as you've already heard, from an ethical point of view, the most contentious issues really anchor around what we refer to as the twin risks of coercion and exploitation. But what's important for you to appreciate is that although we talk about these often together, they are in fact discrete. Coercion we often think about in terms of the exercise of power, threats to competent autonomous decision-making, and the same is true with respect to exploitation in some measure. But what I think is really important to appreciate, at least in this context, is the worry with respect to coercion is not the big stick, but rather the carrot, the inducement. And the question is, at what point does the inducement become such that it is difficult, if not impossible, to refuse or to walk away? And when we talk about exploitation, what we're really talking about there is the issue of unfair advantage. And one of the things that's quite interesting in this context is there's a lot of effort that goes into saying this is about mutual advantage. They get money, I get a baby. But I want to say very clearly that, at least from my perspective, we do in fact have exactly the situation that was alluded to by Vita, a situation of injustice in terms of thinking about what are the harms that are being incurred and what are the benefits that are being secured, and these in fact devolve onto different people. Now, one of the things that I am clearly committed to is the idea that it's a good that shouldn't have a price tag. But what I want to insist upon is that I am not using the term good in its commercial context of a good and a service, but really in that it is something that is good. And there are many good things in the world that we shouldn't attach a price tag to. One of the things I find most difficult in terms of making the arguments that I wanted to make is that very often I find that there's a distraction. In this particular debate, much attempt, I would say, has been made by a number of people to misdirect the conversation by saying, in the context of the debate about payment, that it's really terrible that we are criminalizing people in this context by paying for sperm, ova, etc. One of the things that I think is important for people to appreciate is that this really is misdirection insofar as the issue about criminalization has nothing to do with payment. It has to do with the law, the federal government exercising its power in accordance with the Constitution. And in fact, you could decriminalize this and have every single one of the provinces, in theory, introduce a prohibition on payment. So the issue here really is about the level of government, not the issue of payment. The other thing that we constantly hear about in the context of the art of misdirection is that it's really terrible that people could end up in jail for as much as 10 years and have a fine of up to $500,000. Now, what's important for people to know is that that sounds quite draconian and people are quite upset about this. But in 14 years, we've in fact only had one conviction. And in that context, the fine was $60,000, not 10 years in jail, not $500,000. And I think that the kinds of examples that I hear in this debate is, I'm going to end up in jail because I've given a woman flowers. And I want to say, come on. We have to actually focus on what's really at stake and what's at issue. Again, in the context of what I think of the art of misdirection, we're often hearing that Canadian citizens are suffering from infertility and they shouldn't be denied the same opportunity to build a family. One of the things I want to say when I put that up there is that there's equivocation around what suffering from infertility means, because there's actually physical, medical infertility, there's also social infertility. And we don't have equity, if you want to think about it in terms of the same opportunity, by just putting money on the table, because in other contexts, that's not in fact how people are making families. They're not doing it through money. So you can't kind of have it both ways in terms of the kind of claim that's being made. The last claim is that I hear often is that one of the reasons it's really important is that we should have payment is that currently the situation is such that donors aren't always being truthful, and then we have substandard sperm, for example, in terms of quality. But if we were to pay for it, we would have control. And in fact, this is a very slippery argument because you've created the exact incentive for people to misdirect and perhaps to not provide full information, because there's in fact money at stake. We hear a version of this argument, and now we're looking at the art of money, that people will be paid under the table, that there will be a black market. Arguably, we've had that for 14 years. And that's just not a good enough reason to not legislate about anything, right? I mean, you take your pick. You could just say, yes, but people are going to do it anyways. And you would say, well, that's true. That would even be true of something like murder. People will do it anyways. It doesn't mean it's not a reason to legislate. The problem of undersupply is also often named, and again, it's in a context where I don't understand why we think that it's a supply and demand problem, but moreover, even if I grant that, why would we think that it's a supply that we would meet, or that we would meet that demand through money? I would say to you, we currently have a problem of undersupply with respect to solid organs. We don't say, we don't have enough kidneys, let's go out and buy some. And so I think it's a really interesting thing that we think that this is the way to solve this problem. Doctors who perform IVF and a whole bunch of other people make money, so do the lawyers, so do the brokers. Why shouldn't the women? And I hope we come back to this issue. I don't have time to go into it in great detail now, but I would by analogy say, well, the same thing is true for the transplant doctor, and the same thing is true for any other number of places in the context of healthcare. Yes, not everybody gets paid, and yes, we might think that in certain contexts we need to look at that. The bottom line, and what I hope we come back to, is the claim ultimately in this arena, no matter what argument we introduce or how sophisticated we make it, is ultimately about a vision of the world we want to live in. The world I want to present to you is a world in which we do not actively encourage people to put their body bits into the marketplace. Instead, we find out why they feel the need to do this, and we see if there are opportunities to respond to some of those concerns. Vita has suggested maybe it's a basic income. I might have some other suggestions. But I think we need to think about who are the people that in many cases are finding themselves in this situation. Now, please understand this is not a statement that does not recognize that women are competent, capable, and can autonomously choose to participate in these activities and choose to do so for money. I am not disputing that. I grant that as a fact. What I am saying is that I don't want that as a matter of public policy, that we invent this new job category as though this is something that we want to have as a future for our world. We're all worried about how it is that we represent this and what it does to our pictures of women. And this is what you find on the internet when you just put in the word surrogacy and payment. And I didn't actually cherry pick this, so I invite all of you to go and look, and this is what you find. And what I want to say is most distressing is that they're all headless. You know, and you might be saying that that has to do with respecting privacy, but the most interesting thing is you don't see that when you're looking at egg donors. They all have faces and they're all beautiful. And I worry about what's going on in the marketing there. I want to end by sharing with you 2 videos that I've prepared. They're part of a series. The series is called The Body Economy. The first one is on eggs. The second one is on surrogacy. I have one planned on plasma. I have one planned on selling your hair. I have one planned on selling your breast milk. I really think that this is a broader issue, and I really am arguing to keep the body out of the economy.
The body economy, surrogacy in the marketplace. Being a parent is hard work, a lifelong project full of interesting challenges. Pregnancy and delivery are also hard work. We call it labor for a reason, right? What if a pregnant woman is delivering a baby for someone else? It's a huge responsibility and an amazing gift. Should she be paid for her services, reimbursed for her expenses, or both? I'm Françoise Bales. I'm a bioethicist at Dalhousie University. This year, the Government of Canada is drafting new regulations to strengthen the 14-year-old Assisted Human Reproduction Act, and surrogacy is on the agenda. Currently, Canada prohibits payment for surrogacy. Instead, the law allows women to be reimbursed for pregnancy-related expenses. But some, including private fertility clinics, lawyers, and brokers, want Canada to go further and adopt a fee-for-service model. If women are autonomous beings, shouldn't they have the right to charge for providing such a valuable service? In an ideal world, every surrogate would feel 100% empowered and equal to all the people she'll deal with. She would not feel coerced or exploited. But in the real world, we know consent and autonomous decision-making can be compromised when money is on the table. That's why we don't allow people to sell their organs for transplantation. Our goal should be to strengthen the current legal framework that permits reimbursement of expenses and allows a woman to give the ultimate gift of life without cost to herself and without potential compromise to her autonomy. Learn more at impactethics.ca and join the conversation on Twitter at #TheBodyEconomy.
Thank you very much. That's the second of the videos. If you're interested, they're on YouTube. Look up #TheBodyEconomy. Thank you.
So we'll give you five minutes each to respond.
Can people hear me through this mic?
You have to turn it on.
Oh, that makes sense.
It's the mute button.
Oh. There we go. Sort of there. Thanks. Yes? Any better? No.
Closer. Maybe closer to you?
Any better?
No.
Okay, I'm just gonna go. So I think, I agree with so much of what François says. I am attracted, I am interested in this topic because I think it is a complex one, it's a complicated one, and many of the points that François raised are ones that I agree with to a large extent. So I'll just speak to a few of them on a kind of more philosophical side of things. The point about whether something can be understood to be a good in a non-commercial sense, such that when we commercialize it, it's no longer good in the same sort of way. Well, let's think about what other kinds of goods there are in society, in the sense of value, not in the sense of commodity, right? Art is a good, right? It's important to our social lives. It could be important to our flourishing, to experience, to participate in art. And yet it has a price tag. And the fact that you buy tickets to go to the theater, these should be subsidized and there should be art that's made accessible. But the mere fact that it has a price tag doesn't necessarily undermine the extent to which it's a good in the non-commodity sense of that term. Even something like healthcare or education. These are goods, these are social goods. just because our insurance company, our province, pays our health bills, doesn't mean there isn't a bill, right? Every service you get from your doctor at the hospital has a price tag. It's just that the bill goes to somebody else. But we praise our healthcare system, and we talk about health as a social good. So the mere fact that something has a price tag doesn't undermine the extent to which it can still be celebrated as a meaningful and important social good. The other point I want to raise is with respect to this question of coercion. And I think we're both in agreement that this is a significant worry, and one that we need to address if it's true that surrogates and donors are being coerced, either by another individual or simply by the fact of their own circumstances. Here it is, sorry. This is a problem. So one thing I want to flag that hasn't gotten raised yet is that a bill was proposed this year in Parliament by a member of Parliament who has proposed repealing and replacing various aspects. This is Bill C-404, various aspects of the AHRA. And in particular, he's proposing replacing the language in sections 6 and 7 against payment, removing or replacing that language with language around consent and coercion. So that the most important principles to protect when we're talking about surrogacy and gamete donation is not that these should be not commodified or commercialized, but that the people engaging in these practices are properly consenting, that they're capable of consenting, that they're not being coerced. So I'm just going to quickly read you the language that has been proposed in Bill C-404 to replace a particular subsection 6, with respect to the reimbursement for surrogate mothers in the Assisted Human Reproduction Act. The proposed replacement says, no person shall counsel or induce a female person to become a surrogate mother, or perform any medical procedure to assist a female person to become a surrogate mother, knowing or having any reason to believe that the female person is under 21 years of age, incapable of consenting to becoming a surrogate mother, or is being coerced by a third party to become a surrogate mother. And I think we could understand third party quite broadly, right? Certainly in the philosophical literature on coercion, third party could mean an individual or it could mean one's unfortunate circumstances. So this is not to say that I think we need to immediately abolish these sections in the AHRA and replace them with what's being proposed here. We have good reason to think this bill is not going to become law, but I think it highlights an interesting point, which is that if what we're ultimately worried about is coercion and exploitation, then why don't we just say that? Why are we talking about payment if what we really want to be protecting people from is coercion? Let's just say that in the law, right? And I think we can do that without criminalizing payment, right? Not to engage in misdirection, but just for the sake of ease. I think we can talk about consent and coercion instead and address the important philosophical and ethical concerns that we have.
So there are 3 things that Vita said that I completely agree with. I think at the very beginning, her first slide appropriately lists what the ethical concerns are. They are around the issue of commodification of the body, they are around the issue of erosion of altruism, and they are around the potential for exploitation. So I agree with that framing. I also agree with her comments with respect to the kinds of claims that get made about this undermining dignity, and that very often this is spurious insofar as it can be used in multiple ways to pull in either direction. However, I'm not surprised that people do that because dignity is in the principles that are stated at the beginning, but it's not an area that I go to in terms of making arguments. And the third place where I agree is with respect to the comments she made about patriarchal expectations of gendered altruism. I think we do need to pay attention to that. Where we disagree really is kind of in the framing or the conceptual understanding of a couple of things. So first of all, I've never actually said it's too valuable to put a price on it, and I've never actually talked about it as being of intrinsic value. So at least in my case, that's not what I'm trying to articulate. What I'm trying to articulate is what's at stake in changing the system from an altruistic one to a commercial one, and what's at stake is us, our relationships amongst each other. If I tell you I have a loving relationship with my parents, and then I also tell you that we've agreed that I will love them because they will pay me $100 a week until I die or they die, you might really wonder about the nature of that relationship, right? And it doesn't mean that it's in fact not true, right? I might love them very much and they might love me very much. But there is something that starts to be seen as different. There's a certain kind of feeling you get when you walk somebody across the street just to be kind versus you stand there and say, I'll take anybody across the street for $1. It just seems like a different kind of activity. And that's what I'm asking us to think about. What happens when we take relationships and we ask to be kind or to transact only if we're given a commercial benefit? Another comment that was made was to the effect that we do this every day. We put our body in the marketplace every day. That's absolutely true, but there's lots of things we do every day, and we do them in different ways, which make them slightly different. But more importantly, the fact that we do something and that we do it every day doesn't make it right. One of the things that I often would teach in the context of some undergraduate courses I used to give is I would ask people how many of them shop at Dollarama. And many of them do for all kinds of reasons, many of them good reasons. And I then ask them to think about how the stuff gets in the store for $1, right? How did it get there for $1? Think of where it's coming from, think of what it's made of, think about the lights that have to be turned on, the rent that has to be paid, the people that are working there. How did it get there for $1? You can tell me and I can tell you about the sweatshops that make my running shoes. There's a lot of things in the world that are coercive and exploitative, and I benefit from them, and it's wrong. And I'm not a perfect person, and I continue to participate in some of those activities. But I think it's really important that I be able to name them, and that I not be proud of them, and that at least in this arena, if there's an opportunity to stop it before it gets to the point that I don't know how to dismantle it, then I think that's something worth trying to do. The other thing that I think is really important, and I really kind of want to end on this point, is that everybody talks about coercion and exploitation, and they have a different take on it. And I want you to think about it in these terms. I think that when you think about the worry about coercion, the risk is that you're going to pay them too much. That's the inducement. You've offered them what? What's a fair wage if you're wanting to really think about it in the marketplace? And at what point is it not a fair wage? It's an inducement. They can't say no. And then the flip side of that is at what point is it exploitation? You didn't pay them enough, and you're actually exploiting them. And the interesting thing is I have yet to find somebody who wants to stand up and say that they support payment and that this is what they believe is a fair wage, that this is neither coercive nor exploitative, that they have hit the sweet spot. And I have yet to have somebody tell me that. In the early days, people were quite happy to say that with respect to sperm, because that's all that was in the marketplace at the time, and they used to use the example of jury duty, and we're talking $75. That's not what people are talking about today. And we're talking about OVA and we're talking about surrogacy, both of which are a lot more labor intensive than what we might have expected from men in terms of masturbating to provide a sample. And so in that context, I think it's really important, if we're going to have honest discussions, that somebody be prepared to say, not in a frivolous way, but in a meaningful way, what they think is neither coercive nor exploitative. And I don't have an answer yet from anybody who's actually maintaining that. I have answers from all kinds of people, including myself, who take an hourly wage of minimum wage and try to figure that out. And we come up with astronomical figures. I can get the cost of a surrogacy easily up to $150,000 just by starting with minimum wage and a 24-hour-a-day work. And then I want to say, well, what's fair vacation pay or time off work? Oh, they don't get any. Starting to sound like more like indentured slavery. Okay, and I say that in a context where I know it's got rhetorical force, but it's really just to push the issue. If we're talking money, we should be talking with real dollars and cents so that we actually know what's coercive, what's not coercive, what's exploitative, and what's not exploitative.
You can press the mute button.
All right, thank you both.
Before I open it up, no, this one's working.
Is this one working?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think that one's not working. I guess, Françoise, my question to you, which is something that I sometimes worry about, which is placing Canada's regulations, both its regulations but also its prohibitions, in a broader international context, which is, if Canada is to continue its prohibitions, I think we all know, or many of us know, the international context does not replicate the Canadian situation. That there are, you probably know, people who will then access OVA for purposes.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me? So the point that I'm making, can you hear me now? Now you can hear me. Okay. The point I'm making is my concern about the implications of the prohibitions in a broader international context, and the issue of, say, forum shopping. So what the prohibition does is to induce Canadians to seek OVA donors, for example, from countries which do permit trade in OVA, or do also encourage Canadians to seek to enter into surrogacy arrangements in other countries which do permit paid surrogacy arrangements. And so while the prohibitions protect Canadian women, and for the most part it is Canadian women, they do nothing in a sense to protect women in other countries. And I know that it's difficult for Canadian legislation to do that, but there is nothing that prohibits or has an impact on that kind of forum shopping. And I'm just wanting to hear really what your thoughts are about that broader society or broader international phenomenon.
So I have a number of comments. One of them is to say that, as I suggested in my opening remarks, many of the countries that actually have very similar healthcare systems to ours also have prohibitions and also allow for reimbursement and not for payment. Examples there would include places like New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Finland, Ireland, Israel, etc. So first of all, Canada is not the outlier. If you want to look at outliers, one of the things that I think is true is you can look to the south. We are very close to the United States, therefore we're influenced by the United States. If I think back to Mr. Housefather, he repeatedly said in early debates that, surrogacy is legal in most of the United States. That's actually not true. In the United States, if you look at each of the individual states, there are 11 that prohibit payment for surrogacy. There are 8 that permit payment for surrogacy. There are 31 that are silent. So what is true globally is that there are a lot of places that are silent, and people then move and try to set up a business, and sometimes they get shut down and sometimes they don't. The fact that people are moving globally is true in this arena. It's also true for access to all kinds of healthcare. We now have the term medical tourism. People move around. We also have scientific tourism. Scientists move around. We're not going to be able at this point to have a global position. I say at this point, possibly we will later, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what I think is important is that a country, when they introduce legislation, regulations, policies, guidelines, they're actually making a public statement about what they believe in, recognizing that other countries might believe in something else. And I think one of the things to pay attention to is that just as we're now having a conversation about possibly allowing this, there are other places which in the past have allowed it that are now stopping it. And so I think we have to pay attention not only to where they are, but where there are trends. The last point that you raised is around the extraterritoriality, and that actually at some point is a choice. We don't have very much that is extraterritorial in a Canadian context, but one thing we have, for example, is child abuse. You do it here, you do it there, we don't care. You come to Canada, we're coming after you. You could, if you wanted to, have a similar thing. Canada has chosen at this point not to do that. And you know, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about there is we do have, at least at a global level, a Hague Convention with respect to child adoption. And recently there were efforts, initiatives, questions about whether we should have a Hague Convention with respect to surrogacy. And one of the things that was interesting is that at those meetings, the people who were there from the adoption side were saying, look, the reason we have a Hague Convention is to stop people coming and stealing our children, and it seems very odd that you would now have a Hague Convention to allow people to come and use our women. So I think, you know, there's interesting conversations that need to happen globally.
And I think, Vida, my question for you has to do with one of the issues that we haven't talked about. We talked about, and here I'm thinking the overdonor circumstance. Jeff Niska was in the audience, and this is something that he talks more about, is actually physicians' obligations to do no harm. And so in situations of overdonor, when, in particular, when the overdonor is not using the eggs for her own purposes, but is actually undergoing egg retrieval for purposes only of overdonation, his argument is that the physician is in fact doing surgery that is unnecessary and is in fact breaching his ethical obligations or her ethical obligations by putting that woman through an unnecessary surgical procedure for something that is not for her medical benefit. So I just wanted to hear what your response was to that argument.
So is this one working? Okay.
Yeah.
Does that argument pertain only to women who undergo this for the purposes of selling their eggs, or for women who do this for the purposes of donating their eggs?
I think it would apply in both situations, and usually women who are donating are doing it after they have already,
Right.
they're doing it after they've used the eggs for their purposes as well.
So I think there's an important distinction to be made between the way that we have these conversations about these practices writ large and the way that we have these conversations about these practices qua commercial practices. So, you know, my interest or my concern is in the ways in which we sort of praise, in many other contexts, egg donors and praise altruistic surrogates, and yet condemn the practice of commercial surrogacy or the practice of commercial egg donation. So for me, the kind of important kind of ethical line is the line we seem to draw between these very same practices on the one hand and these practices when a dollar changes hands. So whether or not, I mean, I think there's a very interesting question we could be asking about whether people have a right to have children and whether the satisfaction of that right ends where other people's bodies begin. So do we indeed have a right to have children if our capacity to do so depends on gametes that come from donors or wombs that belong to other people? So I think the question that you're raising is really a question around how far do we think this right to reproduce extends, and not so much a question, you know, is it okay to pay people for the sorts of practices they engage in? And those are just two distinct ethical questions, I think, right? Should we be doing this stuff at all? And if we're going to do them, should we continue to distinguish between paying and not paying as a boundary of moral concern?
Can I just add something? I mean, I think, you know, just again to highlight, I think where we're coming from in different places. I actually don't agree that there's a right to have children. Children is about responsibilities and hopefully taking on those responsibilities. But I think one of the things that's a really weird thing in the Western world is whenever we want something, we just call it a right. And, you know, rights have to come from somewhere, and
Yes.
I just don't grant that we have a right to children.
By way of clarification, I am, you know, am confounded by that question, so I am sympathetic to that position. So I don't mean to actually like come down on the side of we absolutely do have a right. I think there are good reasons to think that that language is not appropriate when we talk about the having of children and the building of families. So I agree with that, and I thank you for the for the comment.
So I want to open it up to the floor now.
I think there are mics on the floor. And again, if you could just introduce yourself before asking the question.
My question is for both panelists. Actually, thank you for very interesting talks and the conversations we've been having. So I want to talk about the point about gender goods or goods and whether certain kinds of things that the question that Mr. Panitch asked about what is a good in this context and if it's gender. Now I want to suggest that, and this is something I would like for both of you to respond to, that you can actually find a list of things that are goods that we don't pay for. Or that are good things we don't pay for, and that the list will be predominantly things that women do. Taking care of children, picking up much of the work when it comes to taking care of dependents, house, work. And there's a pattern there when it comes to things that are good, at least in a family context, that seem to be things that women do, which society treats as not work that should be paid for. And if there's a pattern, then there's a justice issue, a social justice issue. And how would you, both of you, respond to that? Does society have is there an obligation on us as members of society to correct that social justice issue?
So I think that that's a very important point, and I agree with you to a large extent. I think we need to be careful when we defend the failure to pay for various forms of women's work, or perhaps not to pay adequately or fairly for various forms of quote-unquote women's work, that we are encountering an instance or a version of gender inequality, right? So it's a social justice issue. So I guess I was trying to flag precisely that point when I raised this issue about gendered altruism and the ways in which we continue to ascribe to women roles and duties in society that are precisely the ones we don't seem to think of as deserving of a wage, and that we justify this by appealing to their better nature, right? They're better suited to, better predisposed to acting altruistically, and so we use that precisely as grounds to not afford fair remuneration to the work that women do.
So, I mean, I think I want to come at that from a couple of different angles. Part of it is that I don't actually want to buy into the language of commerce, and so I'm actually not typically wanting to think about it either as goods or services, either thinking about it as wages. So then when I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, what are things that are good that don't have money attached to them? Well, you know, I think it's really good that we have the Amazon, the forest, right? And other people want to put a price tag on that, and then we want to transact as to whether you can cut the trees down or not, what your carbon footprint is or not, whether the world owes something to Brazil in order for them to protect the forest, etc. And all I'm saying is that I find it very difficult when we have no way of understanding or having conversations about things that are valuable, things that are right to do, without quickly trying to turn that into something that has a cash amount associated with it. And so I think that's part of what you're hearing in my conversation. It's a frustration that we don't seem to have a way to do anything except through capitalism. So that's one thing I worry about generally. I think the other thing that I worry about, though, is I did say at the beginning I have some sympathy for that claim, about the gendered role of altruism. But I think, I am wanting to at least say, in principle here, we are looking at both sets of gametes, so the claim about payment is being made for both parties, in principle. The other thing that I think is really important is that when you listen to some of the discussion, part of the argument that's been advanced for why we should pay for it in Canada is that it will be cheaper for people if we pay women in Canada. And partly that might be because you don't have to fly to India, but that's really not what they're thinking about, because certain countries like India, it's already relatively cheap, but other countries like the United States, it's very expensive. I don't know if people are traveling to access these services, whether they're going to take the discount option in India or the Cadillac option in the United States, but I am worried about people articulating a value that, well, we can do it for less in Canada, so that's why we should do it in Canada. Do you just mean it's because the healthcare system is going to pay for a lot of the care for the woman, and therefore, in fact, all of us are going to be paying for that? Is that what you mean by that? So I think we need to think about what are all of the pieces of the conversation once we start talking about the money, and again, how much money. And I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me what they think the right dollar amount is.
Hi. So we spent quite a bit of time speaking about wages today, and I'm sure you both looked at the proposed regulations that have been put out, and you probably noticed that postpartum wage loss is not present for surrogates at all. So whereas every other woman in Canada is entitled to 17 weeks maternity leave, right now a surrogate is not entitled to the net loss wages at all, regardless whether or not she has a doctor's note based on my reading. An overdonor as well. So, for example, including in an altruistic, I mean completely altruistic model. For example, say I have a sister, she's in Thunder Bay, she's gone to Toronto, she's here at the clinic for 2 weeks. Her net loss wages are not entitled to reimbursement, and this becomes criminal activity. To my mind, this actually is different from Section 2 and taking care of the best interests of women and protecting their health. I'm curious if both of you or either of you would be commenting on this, and that this is actually something that ought to be included.
First of all, I think, as you know, Health Canada is stuck with respect to the issue of OVA. And basically what's important is that in writing regulations, one is not in a position to contravene the Act. What the Act currently says is that lost wages can be paid for surrogacy. Do I think that there are situations where OVA donors are going to lose wages, might be very sick, might have ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, might be in the hospital, et cetera, et cetera? Do I think that from an equity point of view, they ought to have access to that? Absolutely. I've asked Health Canada if they can do anything in terms of creative thinking that would not be a violation of the Act, because the intent in bringing in the prohibition was that this was not going to be a surreptitious way of giving wages. And so I think in terms of intent, it ought to be possible, but that's going to be a legal decision as to whether or not actually making those payments would be seen as a contravention to the Act. The regulations cannot, in law, contravene the Act.
I would agree with you that it can't contravene the Act. I think there's lots of room in Section 12 sub 1 to include that. And I would love it if both of you would actually encourage Health Canada to include those in Section 12 sub 1. I did have one other point, Francoise. You keep on asking for a number.
Please slow down.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did talk quite quickly. You keep on asking for a number, and at least with respect to surrogacy, one of the frameworks that I think of actually, funnily enough, is considered to be an altruistic model. So when I look at the United Kingdom, for example, typically what is considered altruistic by their courts is £15,000, and anything under than that doesn't have to be accounted for, because their courts have said that this is an acceptable number, that it's not coercive, and we believe it to be altruistic. So if I put that in Canadian dollars, it's actually quite substantial amount of money. So I think there
You think £1,500 for surrogacy is a substantial?
15,000.
Sorry.
And I would also comment on some of the places we've talked about, Australia. They're actually the biggest users of commercial service in the world on a per capita basis. New Zealand, they are importing almost all of their sperm. UK is importing tons of their sperm. So I actually can't think of another place where it effectively, in my opinion, works.
Well, I don't have those pieces of legislation in front of me. I've read those pieces of legislation. That's what they permit. And the fact that, we disagree, I'd have to pull out the pieces of legislation.
Verdi Trubitsky, University of Montreal. Françoise, I'd like to go back to what Sarah just mentioned, your call for what's too high, what's too low, with the concept of inducement and exploitation attached to these levels. What I'd like to try and argue is that this is not really about inducement or exploitation. It's actually about how we as a society see the nature of the service or the work that's being provided here. If a CEO of a big corporation is being offered an exceedingly high salary per year, we would never say that there's undue inducement or that he can't or she can't say no to the job. If somebody's cleaning bathrooms, which is an usually undesirable type of job, and they're not going to get a lot of money about it, for it, we're not going to talk about exploitation unless it's to talk about exploitation, we need a combination of undesirable and not paid enough. So what makes it so challenging when we talk specifically about euthanasia and surrogacy? I'd like to argue that it's about the way that our society sees the nature of the service. And it really is about gendered and cultural norms. So part of it is what Avita said and Ubaka repeated. Reproductive services are traditionally provided for free, not just in the context of assisted reproduction, but in general in our society. So we expect them to be provided for free also in this new context. But also something that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is the intimate relationship that we think women have with their fetuses or their eggs, so that the separation is somehow particularly challenging or is a struggle or is a terrible burden on them. So the notion of surrogacy as a work that requires separation from the baby after birth or separation from your genetic material, I often feel that when we are so afraid of exploitation or inducement, it's because we feel that providing these services is a uniquely challenging act for a woman. And I'd like to challenge that. We have empirical research with surrogates. After the act, a few years after the act, who've had a good experience, no regrets, a lot of high degrees of satisfaction. I'm not talking about India, I'm talking about Western countries where there was a fair amount of autonomy in the decision. Same goes for egg donors. So I'd like us to move away from this constant debate about inducement and exploitation and look in the face of our cultural and social norms when we think about the nature of the services and why they present us with such an emotional, moral challenge when we talk about money.
So I think I have two answers to that. The first one is that if we're really going to go down that route, and please understand what I'm about to argue for is not what I believe, it's not the world I want to build, but if what we're saying is that this is important, valuable work and women should be properly compensated for it, then I would be arguing every single woman who does it should get exactly the same wage. I don't know who's going to pay it, but every single woman does it, because I don't want to just pay the women who are giving the babies away. The ones who make the mistake and keep them, they don't get paid. So I've had 2 children, I should have been paid for those 2 children. You've had a few children, you should be paid. I mean, if what we're saying is that this is valuable labor and people are doing it for free and they shouldn't, well then let's change the whole world and let's pay everyone, not just the ones that choose to be pregnant for 9 months and give away the baby. We pay everybody. Not an argument that I want to defend, but it is to make the point that it isn't just about that. It isn't about creating fairness by saying that this is important work and people shouldn't do it for free. Other people do it for free in one sense and they keep the baby. So what's happening then, if you go down that path, is what are you really paying for? Are you paying for the labor or are you paying for the child and the transfer at the end? If you're really just paying for the labor, then I should be able to sign up as a surrogate and the day I deliver say, thanks very much, I'm glad I have my 15,000 pounds and I'm keeping the baby. So there's a lot more that's going on there. And I think the other thing is that you've used the example of the CEO versus the person who might be, cleaning as sort of 2 extreme kinds of jobs, and whether we be talking about one is coercion or exploitation. I think part of when you're talking about coercion and exploitation is you're looking at the target audience, right? We're not asking CEOs, and I don't know of a lot of CEOs that are actually signing up to be surrogates, but I stand to be corrected. If people are going to tell me that's the target audience, I haven't seen that. And so I think, we have to be realistic that when you're talking about it, it's against a particular set of circumstances, not in the abstract.
So just about the issue of what are we paying for, there are many proposals out there about how to actually operationalize the payment so that it's not for giving the baby at birth. It's along the way. There's a component of the service that is the IVF itself. There's a component in every trimester of the pregnancy. There are many service elements along the way, and each can be compensated appropriately.
Hello, so my name is Angel Petropanagos. I'm from William Osler Health System and Dalhousie. So I'm going to just ask that we shift direction a little bit and ask really sort of where the surrogates are in this conversation and the gamete donors. So, you know, on the whole nothing about us without us principle, one of the things that I notice over and over again is that they often don't get a seat at the table. From speaking with them, I know that they want to be at the table and they want to have a say. So I wonder if you can also just speak to whether or not you know of examples where surrogates and egg donors in particular, and sperm donors as well, have had opportunities in the Canadian context to answer some of these questions, like what is the appropriate amount for payment, whether or not they want to be paid, and even whether or not that is the most important question to them on the table, because in part I doubt that it is from what I have talked to them. They have lots of other concerns, and payment isn't really one of them often, so speak to that.
I'll offer a comment, and then we have qualified people in the audience. If they want to self-identify and take the microphone, that would be great. I will just offer the following comments, at least with respect to egg donors. There's two things I would bring forward. Certainly a number of egg donors I've spoken with are more concerned about the fact that physicians don't do the research in order to give them the information that they require in order to make informed choices. And I find it quite sad that the CFAS has been very active on the payment debate and not so active on the we'll do the research to get the data that women say they want. The other point that I will make is that I do know of egg donors who have been paid for their services or goods, if we're talking in those terms, and they do feel regret, and not in the context that many people talk about, which is that, you know, they're worried about, you know, some offspring out there in the world that they don't know, or they're worried about infertility. The worry that I've heard is how many times they've taken money and the person did not get pregnant, and then they feel bad because they took money and they don't think that they delivered on what was the promise or the nature of the exchange. And I think there's something worth thinking about there, because in fact, in a strict sense, they did exactly what they were asked to do and what they were paid for. And yet that's not how they're processing it, because the couple is still without a child.
I'll just add something quickly. So this is not my field of expertise. Philosophers really don't know how to do empirical research. Shame on us. I mean that seriously. Somebody should teach us. It's not coming on.
Oh,
the battery?
No. You just have to press it longer to turn it on. Oh boy. Sorry.
I'll just make reference to an interesting class action lawsuit that took place in the States that I'm sure many of you know about, but was brought by a number of egg donors in the U.S. against the ASRM, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, who price capped wages, as it were, or reimbursements for egg donation. And a number of egg donors got together and said, you know what, we don't accept your price caps, and we certainly don't accept your reasons for them. And in fact, a good number of women, and somebody I'm sure can tell me the exact number of claimants in this case, were prepared to argue that they thought they deserved to be paid fairly for what they were providing. I think that certainly has to say something about the position of a number of donors in this, with respect to your question.
I just want to add, the ASRM case came forward because these women were racialized, and they said our eggs are in fact worth a whole lot more because there's so few of these eggs in the marketplace. And so I think, again, something worth thinking about. Once you start building a marketplace, it's what the market will bear. So in that context, white women's eggs will be worth less than perhaps women of Asian descent, which was what was at issue there.
My name is Emma Ryman. So my concern with commercialization in Canada is also an international kind of concern. So given that I think the global landscape for surrogacy is kind of contracting, it's not like it used to be in India or Thailand or Nepal, it seems like commercialization in Canada would really make Canada an even more attractive international destination. And I think, as we all know, there's lots of potentially negative consequences that could flow from that, the burden on the healthcare system, conflicting parentage and citizenship regimes, all that sort of stuff. So I guess I'm really interested in hearing about what you foresee if there's commercialization in Canada, for Canada on the international stage.
So I do happen to think that the advantage of talking about exploitation as a lens through which to look at what the harms are allows us to say that some of these arrangements are better and worse than others. Unlike talking about commodification, which would just say this entire practice is wrong, we can't do any of it. Exploitation allows us to say, in some instances, something worse is happening than in other instances. And so when we're looking at the global stage, I do think there's lots of reasons to be worried about global surrogacy as being more exploitative than surrogacy in California. Which is not to say that surrogacy in California might not also be exploitative, but these are questions, these are relative questions, right? I don't actually think surrogates in California are being exploited. I do think surrogates in Nepal have been, certainly. So I have to admit that I'm sort of less worried about kind of exploitation coming home and more worried about the exploitation of global surrogates who are really making the decision against a very, underprivileged backdrop, right, or a limited set of alternative options in a way that I just don't think is true of Canadian surrogates, right? I think it would be less true if we had a basic income, right? But I think the kind of desperation that global surrogates are coming from makes the nature of the transaction much more exploitative. And so I am sort of less worried. And I realize that the way that I'm answering your question focuses in on the harms done to individuals. And your question is sort of a larger picture question about what are some of the sociological harms. But I think I'm answering your question that way because those are where the ethical concerns are that I have, is really with the treatment of surrogates. And so my concerns with the practice, whatever they may be, really does come down to the women involved.
My turn? Hi, I'm Meredith Schwartz from Ryerson University, and I think some of my questions have already been touched upon, but I guess one of the things that I was thinking about as you both were speaking is this idea that we ought to pay women when they're having a child for someone else. And I think that category is kind of an interesting category for some of the reasons that Françoise brought up, but as someone who is never going to have a child myself, I rely on other women to have children, right? Because if they don't have children, then there will be nobody to take care of me when I'm old, and it's not going to be my own kids because I don't have kids. So when we talk about whether we should pay women for having children, we often talk about paying women for having children when they're having them for someone else. But I'm not sure what the scope of that category is, because it seems to me that, at least arguably, every woman is having children for someone else. And so the way I think this has already been answered is that you, Françoise, said, why aren't all pregnant women, if it's labor, then why aren't all pregnant women paid? And so I just think that's a kind of an interesting question, because we do rely on the reproduction of the next generation, but it's not usually talked about unless the person is going to relinquish legal control of that child to someone else, which kind of makes a strange relationship to children, I think. So anyway.
I think that part of the reason for my saying that is it also becomes a way of addressing indirectly some of the concerns about coercion and exploitation. If you just have as public policy, not that only all women will receive child benefits and 6 months of subsidized salary after they've given birth, but we'll actually also provide them with food, money, etc. while they're pregnant, then it just becomes part of what you're entitled to as a citizen. And so it just changes the nature of the reason for the exchange. But only because in the interest of time it's 8:30 and nobody has yet volunteered to give me a price, I'm going to put one out there. so that somebody might wish to respond. So, along with colleagues, we submitted the following information to members of Parliament. Pregnancy is a 24-hour-a-day commitment, 7 days a week for 40 weeks. At a minimum wage of $15 an hour and accounting for 1,600 hours of work, which is 40 weeks of pregnancy, the cost of the labor alone is $100,800. That's without addressing higher wages for overtime, breaks, benefits, vacation time, reimbursement of expenses, workers' compensation, and so on. And so if we're not going to exploit women, surely we want to at least pay them minimum wage, $15 an hour. We're now up to over $100,000. And I want to ask the audience, is that coercive? Is that exploitative? Is that a fair wage?
Minus sleep time is actually very reasonable.
So are you wanting to half it because you're sleeping half the time?
Yeah, I mean not half, but reduce sleep time, and you get to a very reasonable amount.
So is that what we do with our firefighters when they're at the caserne waiting to work? We don't. We actually pay them for that time too because they're on the job.
Okay, I was half teasing because I don't think it's a per hour calculation. I think it's a global amount. But if you...
But that's not what we do with jobs, right? People are paid by the hour. That's how we figure out their salaries.
Some contracts are global.
My name is Leah Swanberg. I've been a surrogate twice. I was not paid. It makes no difference if I was. I've also been an egg donor 6 times. I'm a birth mother. I was not paid as a birth mother to produce a child for amazing parents. I was not paid as a surrogate. What saddens me about all of this is that these researchers, these academics, do not speak to surrogates. They do not speak to egg donors. We did a survey. I was the person in the picture up there. I'm the only person that's been charged. It was the most terrifying and most amazing experience of my life. I would tell anyone in this room, you say someone buying flowers will likely not be charged. Well, I never thought I'd have a gun to my head for helping people have families, but I did. And I will say this, we surveyed 400 women that are currently in the surrogacy process. 98% of them said they did not want to be paid. What they wanted was to be able to self-direct what the expenses were. They did not believe Ottawa or some bullshit society should decide whether a massage should be something that is reimbursed because she had a massage the month before she became pregnant. We've been lobbying in Ottawa. I brought surrogates and egg donors to the table for the first time, and I'm telling you, every member of Parliament, and we've seen over 100, and every senator, and we've seen 15, said, wow, when they heard the surrogates tell their stories that were compassionate. These women don't want to be paid. They want this to be a fair system. They want to self-direct their reimbursement and their expenses. So I wonder, Francois, I wonder, Rita, how are you speaking to these women? Because I will bring them to you. I know that Angel has done amazing work with speaking to surrogates and speaking to donors, and it is necessary for this work to really happen.
I mean, I absolutely appreciate that. And as I said, I'm trained in the wrong sort of thing to be doing this kind of work. I find these questions fascinating, and I'm compelled by your position and your circumstances. So my training is as an ethicist, so I think about the kinds of ethical questions that are at issue here. And I largely rely on the work of other people who are doing the kind of legwork that you're doing in order that I can kind of think through the ethical issues. So I appreciate the work that's being done, and I think that's, that's something I absolutely want to say. And I guess I want to come back to the question about payment versus reimbursement, because I think, I think it's a very academic distinction, and I agree with you that if the reimbursements were appropriate, right, I would be perfectly satisfied. And in terms of who gets to determine what counts as appropriate, well, of course, right, of course we absolutely have to be listening to the voices of surrogates and letting us know what kinds of reimbursements matter, and how extensive and et cetera they should be. So I suppose thank you for your comment, and I absolutely support the position, and I certainly certainly would not be advocating for payment against the wishes, right, or for repealing the AHRA against the wishes of the people in this field. So my intention really is to draw out concerns or respond to concerns of an ethical nature, right, in these sorts of practices. But if reimbursement is the strategy, then I'm absolutely all for it. I just happen to think that reimbursement imposes a very heavy burden on people who are already carrying a very heavy burden to justify, right, to provide receipts, to explain themselves. And I understand that it's very hard to come up with like the perfect figure that would like accommodate all of these sorts of expenses. But I absolutely just think that when we're imposing such a, I don't want to call it a burden, but when somebody is doing such valuable work, that they should then also have to get forms signed from people, attesting to how much they would otherwise be paid, producing receipts, negotiating over things like massage. I would like to see that process simplified. And so in some sense, I think like a standardized wage would just simply simplify that process and remove those kinds of obligations. So that's why I think about it in terms of a wage rather than a reimbursement. But again, I think that language is just very academic and maybe completely besides the point. So thank you.
So I'm not sure how it is that you're understanding, or what are you meaning when you're saying, do you talk to, donors and surrogates? I certainly talk to them. I am not a skilled empirical researcher, and when I have had grants that have required empirical research, I have worked very hard to identify people who have those skills, who work with me, and who do that work. One of the things that I actually think is very unfortunate about bioethics is that there are a lot of people doing empirical research who do not have training in empirical research. So I admit that I don't have that training, and I do not do that kind of work without having people around me who are doing that. Do I talk to surrogates? Yes. Do I talk to egg donors? Yes. I have several members of my family that are born through IVF. So it's not about whether I talk to people or not.
I didn't mean speak to them. I mean, I have a Chinese neighbor, very similar.
Right, but that's why I'm answering the question.
And so I'm not stating that. I'm asking you, in your research, in your presentation, where you seem to understand the surrogate and you seem to understand the egg donor, and she regretted doing it for payment. I'm just wondering how many surrogates, how many egg donors, and what that research really looks like from, I spoke to 100 people, I spoke to 1,000 people, or I talked to my neighbor who was an egg donor.
Yeah. Well, I can't answer those questions for you right now. You can look at some of my published work, and I can certainly talk to you, more directly about that. But as I've said, that's not the focus of my work. My work is primarily philosophical, which is what I'm trained to do, and so I work with ideas. But a lot of those ideas get challenged by talking to people who don't share them, or they get bolstered by people who do share them. I think that one of the things that is very important about this part of the conversation is your claim that it's 98%. So for example, I don't know if it's 97, 98, 60, whatever. I haven't done that work. I'm not skilled to do that work, but I'm prepared to believe you. And therefore, if that's the case, I think it's really sad that we're having a discussion about payment if 98% of surrogates would be happy to work with a good reimbursement system, because then our energy should be going into making it a good reimbursement system. Now, it's been 14 years for us to get there. There's no excuse for that, and I have been a staunch critic of Health Canada. I think it's shameful that we had 14 years of uncertainty where lots of things were happening that were not good for any of the parties involved, okay? It's just not good to be working in situations of uncertainty. But the one place I think where I do disagree perhaps with some people is with respect to the claim that the current process that's being developed is too burdensome. And the only reason I say that is that there's two areas that people have identified as burdensome: filling out these forms and having to keep the documentation for 6 years. And all I can say back is I fill out those forms, or forms that would be very similar to that, all the time for my employer when I take a business trip. I have to sit down, I have to write my name, my address, my employer number, I have to write down everything, and I have to have a receipt for everything, and I have to photocopy it, etc. Now,
are you getting paid while you're making that list and writing that down? That was my question.
Well, the interesting thing about that is I feel like I work 24 hours a day, so I'm really happy that Marty thinks that she sleeps 12 hours, because I sure don't. No, I mean, I think that I'm doing it on my own time. I don't know that my employer thinks that, but I work 12-hour days, and I don't believe I'm being paid for that. But honestly, if you wanted to say to me, we should look at that as something that should be reimbursable because it takes time to fill that up, I'd be open to hearing that kind of a comment. I think what I'm saying back to you is if what you're saying is accurate, and I have no reason not to believe that 98% of surrogates want a good functional reimbursement system, they don't want to be paid, then you're actually saying something that's very similar to what I've been trying to say, which is it's about relationships and emotions and things that are very important to people, and we tarnish those by thinking that those relationships were paid for. And I just really do believe that when money changes hands in certain ways versus other ways, it changes something, right? And so, to me, that's a really important fact, and we should be working with that, and we should make the best reimbursement system that we can. And I think, I have to say, I thought that I wasn't sure what we were going to get out of Health Canada. I think we've got a really good starting point. I think there are ways it can be improved.
Cindy Wasser, I'm a fertility lawyer in Toronto. This discussion is the perfect segue to my question, which deals with decriminalization and the issue we have with the proper reimbursement scheme. So, Françoise, you alluded to one of my favorite arguments in your first part of the debate where you spoke about whether the power of the criminal law would ever be used against an intended parent for sending flowers to a surrogate or donor. And you replied with, rhetorically, oh, come on. No one but Leah has been prosecuted. For many years, there was a law in the United States that allowed for the separation of children from their parents as they entered the country illegally. That government after government never utilized on moral grounds until the president of the free world, properly elected, decided to do it and caged those children for weeks upon weeks. So the fact that we have criminal sanctions and don't use them doesn't actually protect the public from them ever being used. There can be, in fact, an RCMP investigation into any sanction or any breach of the current legislation. The sanctions themselves have no separation or no rationale towards the particular crime. They apply equally to sending flowers to cloning in the basement, up to $500,000, up to 10 years in prison, or both. And it would be up to a judge to decide what is the appropriate measure. Not up to you, not up to the RCMP, not up to the prosecutor. In the meantime, while we got there, everybody would be suffering, paying a lot of money to their criminal lawyers. The public would be paying for the prosecution, as they did in Leah's case, for nothing. Her prosecution was a farce that 16 prosecutors didn't want to touch, by the way. I don't know if you know that. So I don't think we should just say, let's leave it because we don't use it. I think we need to remove it. And decriminalization would then allow for the surrogates to, and the donors to properly say what their expenses are, and the IPs to deal with it.
I disagree with that interpretation, and the reason I disagree with the interpretation is that the way our Constitution is written, the federal government only has criminal law powers that it can exercise in this arena. So when you say we should decriminalize, what you in fact you are saying is we don't want the federal government to be involved, and what you're also saying is we don't want a uniform system across Canada. What we want is the provinces to deal with this. Here's the problem with having the provinces deal with this. We've already heard about global tourism. What we would be doing then is introducing a situation in Canada where you would have another kind of interprovincial tourism. Why do I believe this? If you take it away from the federal government and you give it to the provincial government, all you need to get payment on the table is for one province not to legislate. I guarantee you, I'm willing to put a huge bet on this, PEI is not going to legislate. Newfoundland is not going to legislate. Neither of those provinces have IVF clinics. It would be a waste of public dollars to introduce a law to say it's illegal to have payment in our province. And I would not want them spending their time. If we're talking opportunity costs, there's many other things they should spend that on. What about my province, Nova Scotia? What about New Brunswick? Unlikely. What about Saskatchewan? Maybe because they've actually allowed payment for plasma. So maybe they're going to think, well, yeah, let's allow this kind of payment. Ontario and Quebec for sure are going to legislate. I don't know which way they're going to go, but given what they've done on blood, I would imagine that they would prohibit payment. So my point is that talking about decriminalization is really just about shifting who's going to have authority. And if we bring it back to payment, all you're going to do is end up perhaps with a patchwork across the country, which I don't think is ideal. Now, beyond that, I think that when you're talking about criminalization, if you're going to have a law, there has to be a penalty. We may not like this penalty. Maybe you think it's the wrong amount of years and the wrong amount of dollars. If so, I'm happy to engage with that. It's quite possible it's the wrong amount of years and the wrong amount of dollars. But you can't have a law that says you must not do this, and then you do it and you say, oh, okay, we don't have a penalty, do it again. I mean, that's just not how laws work. There has to be a penalty. So we may not like this penalty, we can have a conversation about it. But the other thing I find fascinating is there are many areas of healthcare, for example, where we have a similar situation. One that everybody here would be familiar with is medical assistance in dying. We have a law that says you can do it in this way. If you don't do it in this way, you're subject to a penalty. Now, as it happens, the penalty is lower than in this particular piece of legislation. So as I said before, if you wanted to argue about how we got the right numbers, I'm happy to entertain that argument. But I would stand firm that I do not want this moved to the provinces. It will be a disaster for us as a country. We already have too many challenges right now where we cannot get federal, provincial, territorial agreements, and this hurts Canadians on a lot of fronts.
The provinces have the power, however, to regulate in many areas, as you just noted, and that is the process of Canada. That's how federal society works. And so they do have provincial prosecution powers over all kinds of things, regulating fishing, etc. There are prohibitions against everything in every province. That's the democracy of the federal nation. So that's the country we live in. Why not this?
Well, as I said, you could argue for that. I just don't hold that belief. I think this is an area where it would be a benefit to have a uniform system, and so I'm arguing for uniformity.
Good evening. One more question?
Yes,
So
just one
we're
more.
about 10 to 9, so yeah,
I'll be brief.
One more question and then go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentations. It's a treat to hear philosophers. My name is Juliette Guichon. I work in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary. At a pragmatic level, it seems very unlikely that this bill will pass because I think that Canadians are very concerned.
Sorry, Julia, which bill are you talking about?
The bill that would decriminalize payment for gametes, embryos, and gestation capacity.
Okay, so just to be clear, Mr. Housefather has already acknowledged that it's not going anywhere in this particular parliamentary cycle.
Right, but just generally, and the reason I say that is because this would entail subsidizing the industry, and the industry would then be open to people coming from abroad to have Canadian women gestate their gametes, and then the child then born would have a Canadian passport. And if the child had difficulty, then the child would be transferred to sick kids at Canadian expense. And the pregnancy would be subsidized by Canadians. So I think that if the Calgary Olympic bid teaches us anything, it's that electors don't want to be taken for suckers. And I really think that it won't go anywhere. People don't want our healthcare system to be used for purposes that don't have to do with building the country.
I don't know if this one is working. No. Okay. So all I'll do is raise the possibility that that's already happening. Because our surrogates are unpaid, that is attractive to citizens from other nations who come here to, you know.
I agree with you, but there's a problem of supply. Because if there weren't, they wouldn't be wanting to pay them. So an industry is different. I mean, we're seeing that with marijuana decriminalization. Suddenly, there's all talk about, there are lots of operations, there's advertising. It's an industry, and now there's a shortage of supply, right? So having an industry is different from having
a practice that involves relatively few members and is not really in public view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the numbers are going to look like in terms of supply might go up, the demand might go down. If it turns out to be quite expensive, if they're going to, if they should be paid $150,000, demand might
be very high in China, for example.
I guess that depends on how much we charge in Canada. But the point is well taken. All I wanted to do was flag that it's already quite attractive to foreign prospective parents that surrogates here are unpaid and that we have a healthcare system for which they don't also then need to compensate costs. So this is already a bit of a worry, and I share that concern.
Our home's insurance covers international clients. Every hospital across Canada issues a bill to international intended parents. The Canadian healthcare system is caught on finally, which for us in the industry is great news. Nobody wants to exploit Canadian healthcare, and I'm telling you, every international parent that I've ever worked with, or that we hear across the country, every good agency, every good lawyer tells people get insurance. It may not cover the women because there's no way to opt out of provincial healthcare, but everyone is getting a bill. Intended parents coming to Canada know they are coming not to abuse our healthcare system. I can assure you of that and provide you information later.
Okay, I think we are at time. So please join me in thanking our panelists for this evening. And I think Trudeau wants to encourage you to come out tomorrow morning.
Yeah, so we thanked already the speakers, but I would want to acknowledge also the support of all the volunteers here from Health Law Canada, the Institute for Health Policy Management and Evaluation, the Faculty of Law, particularly also the Mary and Philip Seaman donors. So we received a donation from the Seaman family. This is part of the Mary and Philip Seaman Health Law Seminar Series, so I would like to thank the donors also for their contributions. But join me again in thanking the speakers for an engagement today. I invite you to continue to debate tomorrow, not just on commercialization, but also on donor anonymity, funding for IV, gene editing, and so on. So hope to see many of you tomorrow.